Welcome everyone. We're just going to go ahead and give it a minute or two before we get started to let everybody go ahead and file in. Okay, greetings everyone. Hello and thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, Unveiling the First Higher Education Institutional Policy Database. Just a couple of housekeeping items while everybody gets settled. We are using the Zoom webinar platform for today's webinar, so your mics and cameras are disabled by default. If you have any technical issues during the webinar, please use the chat function and select all panelists, and we will work with you directly to sort it out. If at any time during the webinar you have questions for our panel today, please use the Q&A function. Please note that we'll be holding questions until after the presentation. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to AACRAO's Deputy Director, Melanie Gottlieb.
Thanks so much, Annetta. Good afternoon and happy Wednesday. I am Melanie Gottlieb, Deputy Director of AACRAO, and I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar where we will unveil Higher Ed Policy Central, an AACRAO and CollegeSource project. We shared our plans last year at this time with our members, and I'm truly excited to share with you the initial results of the hard work of our colleagues at CollegeSource. As always, we are hopeful that our technology will not fail us. This is a large Zoom call, and we at AACRAO are working at home like many of you, and are working at the mercies of our home Wi-Fi. So bear with us if we have any glitches. You may use the chat freely while on the webinar. If you have a question for Troy or myself, please use the Q&A section, and we will get to it in the Q&A section at the end of the webinar. So joining me today is my friend and colleague, Troy Holliday, President of CollegeSource. So let's talk about our agenda today. First, I'm going to share the context and the concept, why we needed a policy database, and then I'm going to turn it over to Troy, who's really going to dig into the design and creation. He's going to give you a demo of the database and talk about next steps, and then we'll go into Q&A. So let's talk about the context and the concept for a policy database. I have been at AACRAO now for about 5 years, and those of you who know me know that prior to that, I was a longtime member at AACRAO, and so I was sitting in the positions that our members are sitting in now, first as a registrar, later as an international credential evaluator, and later as an admissions director and VP for enrollment management. And in every single one of those institutional roles, I would be asked by someone across campus to develop a policy. And if I weren't being asked to develop a policy, I was being asked to, how do other people do this, that, or the other, identifying a particular need that is emerging on our campus that we need to create some sort of a policy structure about. And how did I go about doing that? The way that I went about doing that was, one, if I felt like I had a good connection with local colleagues, I might call someone and have a couple of conversations. That would give me some context. I might spend several hours searching catalogs that I might have on a shelf for the institutions that we might have been articulated with. We might have copies of those catalogs. And so I might pour through and see, what did they do? How did they do it? Or more recently, I would spend hours combing through websites, trying to figure out where they had their catalog, where they put their policies, what they said, Googling, searching on the website for keywords, and trying to figure out, what do my peer institutions or my state institutions do? for this particular piece, because you don't want to make it up entirely. You want to have a sense of what people are doing. So fast forward at AACRAO, of course, we get calls from our members all the time asking for example policies across the academic spectrum, across the campus. And we've been asked to collect them and have made several attempts to do so. We've done it through surveys, we've done it through just email collection of policies, and the stuff that we get from campuses is sort of all over the map in format. It doesn't necessarily include or answer all of the questions. And then once we have this pile of PDFs and Word documents and emails, what do we do with it? How do we organize it? How do we find a way to make it searchable? And the problem, frankly, from an AACRAO perspective, was a bit overwhelming. And we were really having a hard time finding a solution that was going to both meet the member request and need and be cost effective as the association to really build from the ground up. So, funny story, I was struggling with this problem. We had a recent iteration of trying to collect policies, which I really didn't feel like what we got back was great. And I was having a conversation at a meeting with a CollegeSource colleague, and I thought, hey, when I was institution-based, I remember I used one of your products, tests, that collected catalogs. Do you have any of that data? Is there anything that you can do to help us with identifying this data? And Carrie Cooper at CollegeSource said, I'm going to connect you with Troy because I think we might be able to help you with this. And that is where this sort of conversation began. And Troy and his folks at CollegeSource really took the idea and ran with it. And I'm really excited to show you where we are in this project now. So I'm going to turn it over to Troy.
Sure, thanks, Melanie. And thank you for approaching Carrie with that idea. Carrie's our CEO and head cheerleader and company character minder and about everything you can think of. And she has a lot of energy for projects like this. And I was super excited about it when she shared the idea with me because I, like you, spent my time in higher education. I came from the academic systems and before that, the academic advising side, also a professor. And so a lot of the times what we're looking to do is just build tools that we wish we'd had, right, when we were out there in the trenches. And so that really informs what we do. And it's nice to hear your experience. And I wanted to share mine that I had been where many of our audience is at one point in my past. So really the definition and purpose of a higher ed policy central database is, one, it's an ultimate reference for policy writers. As Melanie mentioned, sometimes you just have to come up with policy. And if you don't know where to start or your background isn't in legal documentation or any other public policy or some other field that would really help, you can really feel at sea. And of course, the best thing to do is to go and try to find similar policies to what you want in other catalogs, hopefully catalogs of institutions that are similar to yours. So that's the number one need, I think, is a reference for policy writers. Another need is a powerful tool for researchers. So if you want to know, for instance, how many institutions have written policy on a specific topic since a particular event, there's no easy way to do that. And CollegeSource really has been we've been in this game a long time, since 1971. And we were founded on the principle that colleges were essentially keeping libraries of other colleges' catalogs on hand in print as reference materials. And so we started archiving the nation's catalogs. In the last decade, the focus has really been on course descriptions for transfer purposes and program information. So not as much on policy. We tend to collect the whole catalog, but we break the courses out into data. So we had a lot of that data, but it was kind of locked in, big text documents, PDFs, really. So the third thing I want to mention here is that, doing this as a partnership with AACRAO is great because it's a way for CollegeSource to underpin what AACRAO does. And we always felt like a strong AACRAO, a strong professional organization for admissions officers and registrars is good for everyone, but especially good for CollegeSource. You're our customers, right? And we want to see a professional organization out there for you. So we like to put wind in the sails of AACRAO, and this is a way that we could do that. So it was a great project for us, but then it's going to be a great benefit of membership to you all to have this policy database available to you. And I feel like I should bring up my product placement when I say that, and get my nice AACRAO mug here. COVID-19 is an example of just yet another thing that has happened in the last, I mean, it feels like bigger than just another thing, but it's another thing that has happened in the last X years that has reminded us that we need policy, right? And we don't always have a policy ready. So institutions are scrambling to write pandemic policies today in the same way that they were scrambling to write policies on campus shootings, let's say 4 or 5 years ago. Unfortunately, a lot of the things that drive policy are negative. But that's the nature of the beast. And policies are an important vehicle for helping people get through tough times, right? Knowing what to expect from the institution, knowing what the rules are, what behavior is expected, what penalties there are for deviance and things like that. Those are all really important to have spelled out for students and a way to help us through these kind of crisis times. What will happen if there's a pandemic? How will I know if I'm a parent? How will I know my child is going to be that their safety is going to be looked after? And as a student, how do I know I can continue my education during a time like this? So policy is super important. I'm going to talk a little bit, maybe quite a bit actually, about the how we made the soup, if you will, because I think this is something that would be of interest to you all. I think the first thing that's worth mentioning is it sounds easy to say, why don't we just make a database of policies? Right. And I have this phrase that I use a lot of times with developers that I say, when we get into like a think tank meeting, a design meeting or whatever, and we're generating requirements for a project, we can't use the phrases, why don't you just, and all you have to do is, or why can't you just, and all you have to do is, because we tend to oversimplify things, right? So I'm going to ask a question, a rhetorical question that'll kind of maybe open up your mind a little bit to the complexity of this. And that is, what is a policy, right? What is a policy? Can you define it for me? Can you open up a catalog and find a policy and point to it? And I think you can, but if I pointed to another piece of text that kind of looks like a policy, would you be able to tell me why that is or is not a policy? They aren't as cut and dried as you think. And it's not that institutions go around putting the label policy on everything that's a policy, right? So that is ground zero, understanding what a policy is. And then we started thinking about, well, do we collect only academic policies? And after a very short time of kind of looking at examples, I came up with the stance that says, first of all, if it looks like a policy, we're going to treat it like a policy. And if it's in a catalog for an institution of higher education, it's an academic policy. I don't care, if it doesn't specifically reference grades or courses or instructors, if it's about campus violence, if it's about health and safety, if it's about parking, and whatever the policy is, that's a policy related to the campus, and it's a higher ed policy, and so we don't call it the higher education academic policy central. It's the higher education policy central. And I also think that many of you are looking for those policies more than you are the bread and butter policies like residency or grade types. I mean, most of those you've had covered for years, and you tweak them a little bit from decade to decade, but it's the new stuff that comes around that you really need help on. And that's the stuff that we want to, make sure is in the database. It is definitely true, as Melanie said, the institutions are not predictable in the way they present policies. They're relatively unstructured objects. And for that reason, there's not a lot of automation that can be done on this. Knowing where a policy begins and ends, and it's not as easy as pointing a computer at it and saying, look for these words or look for this visual structure or formatting structure on a page to find out what's a policy. Because the difference to when a computer looks at, let's say, a professor's bio and some kind of on-campus like residency policy, how does it know the difference? right? So it's not easy to automate this stuff. How often do we collect? That was a question that we asked ourselves. Right now, we're on a biannual process, which means we're putting every institution on like every other year to collect. We might accelerate that as we go, but as you might estimate, there's a cost to this, and that's the investment level we feel comfortable with. Organizing principles and structures, we'll talk about that in a little bit. We had to think about how we're going to organize the information and make it usable, because when everybody's organizing things different ways, how do we come up with a structure that allows us to all look at it the same way without destroying the structure that can be very important in the way it's presented by the institution? Who do we start collecting with? We work with AACRAO to develop a diverse list of institutions, 2-year, 4-year, public, private, geographically dispersed, to try to get a range of catalogs to start with. And then we had to look at timelines and costs, of course, and we'll cover all that as we go. One thing I wanted to kind of point out as an early data point. So we were looking to get 700 and some catalogs in by November for the prototype. We have almost 1,000 actually right now. But I looked at the data on the first 920 catalogs, which come from 809 institutions, because some institutions have more than one catalog. And about 1 in 20 catalogs were missing policies. Now, when I say missing policies, I meant we didn't find them. That doesn't necessarily mean there weren't policies, but things like dead links or possibly policies being separated out in a way that they're hard to find on the website or not connected at all to other catalog information, so we didn't find policies for 5% of them. We are going to go back and kind of double check our methodologies on those to see if we can find the policies. And if we can't, then we'll let the institutions know that their policies aren't publicly accessible. But just to kind of put that into a data perspective, the 1 in 20 or 5% that were missing policies, about half of those were 2-year schools, trade schools, technical schools, community colleges, fine arts schools, those kind of things. I don't know that means they shouldn't have policies. I think it means I don't know why they need policies as much as a 4-year institution, I think. I don't, but why half of those, I think it's just because of the nature of the beast. And about a quarter of those were things where we sort of didn't expect to find policies, like branch campuses or online correlates, adult learning correlates to like an on-campus thing. So maybe it's less likely a policy would be there, but a quarter of those were 4-year institutions, right? So 1 in 80 were 4-year institutions who I hesitate to say should know better, right? So those policies have to be available to students easily. And if they're not available, like if we can't find them, chances are a student can't find them because we're looking with an agenda. So that's really important. And that'll be one thing that we do as part of this effort, is just to make sure that people know if their catalogs are missing policies. As far as structuring the data, if you want to look at some averages, we went with a kind of sections, policies, and details structure, and I'll explain that in a minute. But there are about 6.5 policy sections per catalog, meaning if you're looking for policies in a catalog, you're going to find them in about 6 different places, 6 or 7 different places. Once you find them, you're going to have about 58 policy sections on the average, which sounds like a lot, and it is. And then under that, you might have as many as 63 like individual items. Now, we call these sections policies and details, but I tend to think of it like they're all just levels, right? And when I say that, I can't help but think of the Seinfeld episode. So if you're a Seinfeld fan, you'll know what I'm talking about. And if not, afterwards, when you download the slides, there's at the bottom right, it says it's all levels. You can click on that and they'll take you to a YouTube video that shows you what I'm talking about. But Kramer, busts into Jerry's apartment like he always does and tells him that he's getting rid of all his furniture and he's turning his apartment into levels, and it's all going to be carpeted and there's going to be throw pillows around. It'll be like ancient Egypt, right? And the reason I bring that up is like, when we call them sections, policies, and details, those are fairly loose labels. You just really need to think of them as level 1, 2, and 3, like Russian nesting dolls or something, where each section is policies and they're many to one. So many to one policies to sections nested within sections, many to one details nested within policies, and that helps us maintain the kind of top-down structure that was present in the catalog, but also collect the objects in a way that are I hesitate to use this word because I made it up, but blobular, that are just, kind of object oriented, where you can search across the database. So I think we're ready for a demo at this point. I'm going to point out that today I am using a screenshots for a couple of reasons. We do have a live functioning product. It's not live to an audience, but live on a server. It's on our dev server, and I was a little worried that the connection from Zoom with multiple people on it to a VPN to a development server would create some problems. So I decided to use screenshots. I'll try to guide you through them in the same way that I would if I were using a live demo. I also thought then, of course, it's ready afterwards if you want to have a better look at this thing, then the screens are all there. So we're going to be using screenshots today. We're also going to be looking at a prototype. Now this screen that you're looking at right now is kind of like what it might look like in the end after it's had the graphical design applied to it. So this is one of our prototype graphical design screens. We're going to keep it really simple. Our goal is that, what is exciting about this tool is not bells and whistles, it's what it does. It's the utility of it, right? There are some really basic needs that are being met by this, and we're going to keep it basic and clean and straightforward as much as possible, because we know it's just about getting to the information. You don't necessarily want to see pictures of, AACRAO faces or CollegeSource faces on this thing and learn about us as a company or whatever. We're just trying to deliver a usable tool, and we keep that in mind while also making it visually pleasing. So when I go to the next slide, we're going to actually pop into what it actually looks like today inside the development server, and you're going to see some placeholder things like logo ? And you'll see some differences from slide to slide, which I'll try to point out. But it's it's basically the same thing, just in its most simple format. Okay, so on the front page, you've got the higher ed policy database. You really have two doorways into different ways of looking at data, and I'm going to pursue one line of looking at data and then another line of looking at it. And the first one is this kind of hierarchical nested view where you dig through an institution's policies and see them in context. And the second one is to use the keyword searching across policies. So let's start with this hierarchical approach. I'm going to type in San Diego into this find policies in the by institution. When I search, I'll apply, so I go ahead and search, and I get a list of colleges with San Diego in the title that are in San Diego. And even if they're in like San Diego County, so you'll see Carlsbad and National City in here in Chula Vista. So I'm going to select the one at the bottom here, which is San Diego City College. And if you follow the giant blue cursor, you'll see what I'm clicking on at each step. Okay. So this one, before I scroll down to show you some of the lists of policies, I want to point out that once you're in a catalog, you can still keyword search within that catalog. So if you just want to search across all the policies within a particular catalog, you can do that. You can also, we default to the current publishing year, but once we have historic data, you'll be able to, like if you wanted to search an older catalog, you could do that. And the hierarchical structure has an expanded, it has a tree, right? So you can expand all or collapse all to kind of navigate your way through the policy. So if I scroll down, we're just going to look at a fairly simple policy to start with. Let's look at residency. So once I click on the residency status, I just get a look at that policy. I can add it essentially to a shopping cart. So if I add it to saved policies, it'll go into this hopper of policies that I'm just kind of bookmarking for later, maybe to export. And you'll notice in the top right corner, we're going to have at least an Excel export for this, probably a PDF export as well, so that you can make reports out of these things or data piles that you can then work with. So let's close this and pick another one. We'll also pick up this factors considered to determine residency. And by the way, so if you think about this, I think what we're in here is policy, residence policy with policy details. So each one of these is a detail of the residency policy. So I'll pull out this factors. I'm going to add that to my list. And now I have both of them in my saved list. If what I really wanted was the factors and not the residency status, I could just go up to the top here and click on that red X, and that will get rid of the one I don't want, right? So this is fairly basic navigational kind of ideas, but it's what you'd expect to see, and I want you to know it's there, the ability to sort of keep things in a cart. Once you close this out, you can always find this hopper of policies in your upper right where it says My Saved Policies, and you can pull those back up and add to them or delete them as needed. and I'm just showing going in and out of that my save policies. So next we're going to kind of dive in and look at things, look at policies across the database. Melanie, I just curious, just to take a bit of a pause here. Do you get a sense of how many institutions or how many researchers will be looking across catalogs versus diving into a particular catalog? I mean, I have a sense of what I think where the usage is going to be, but I'm curious what you think.
Across multiple institution catalogs?
Yeah, do you think they'll be looking by topic across catalogs, or mostly digging into catalogs of institutions that they're curious about that institution?
I think it will be both, but I would say looking at institutions in your state, or every institution has identified a set of peer institutions, and so they might be looking at who their peers are and how they manage a particular policy.
Yeah, that's kind of what I expect. And I think what constitutes a peer institution is always really interesting, because you might be a public school that actually feels a little more like a private school, or acts a little more like a private school, or vice versa. Or you might be a small school with all the problems of a big school, or a big school that really feels more like a small school. So your comparables are something you're going to want to control, not something that we would control, right? So let's dive into the policy.
We're getting affirmation of that, just as an FYI. Stat. Like, yeah, same policy, many institutions.
Yeah, right. So I'm just going to put a word in here, and you'll notice that I'm searching in policy text. I've got that little orange radio button clicked. I put in the word violence, and then I'm hit, by default, the search titles only is on. So it means it's searching the titles of the policies, not the text of the policies. You can obviously unclick that and get the text as well. I also chose a state filter for Iowa and for public institutions. I chose this because one of the earlier, from recent memory, one of the earlier school shootings happened in Iowa. So I wanted to see, okay, how many people have written like violence policies in the state of Iowa? Now, maybe that's not the best keyword, so we'll get to that in a minute. I came up with only one result. In this case, it's Northeast Iowa Community College that has one on campus sexual violence, which really wasn't the thing I was looking for, but good to know it's there. Let me try again. And this is the policy, but get out of that. So this time I'm going to broaden that out a little bit. And if I take off the search titles only, but all the other same factors, I get 11 results here. Again, maybe not quite what I'm looking for, but you can see that, as I opened it up, I got more results. Now, I've got to highlight a little blue box around that total rows 11 on the upper right, because this is a good example of what state we're in with the database. As I was working through the database live, I was getting lots of results in some cases, like pages and pages of results. And I called the developer and I said, like, hey, I really need, I want like, if I get 6 pages of results, how many is that? How many is there to a page? I want to know how many I'm getting up there. Can you put a little bug up there that tells me how many rows are there? And he did. So you'll see on some of these screenshots, it was like 20 minutes later, he was really fast about that. That's Glenn Macario, one of my heroes. But so you'll see some screenshots that have that and some that don't, because as I was going through taking screenshots, I was finding things and saying, okay, make sure that when I click here, it takes me to this spot, or can we add this little element to the screen? So we're still in that phase where we're just kind of rounding out corners now that we're like, feel really strong about the data collection. Okay. So if I go back now, let's say I'm going to search for policies that actually reference a gun. So policy text, I'm searching the titles only, and I've taken off all the sub filters. And if I search that, actually, I didn't take off the sub filters. I put in public and 4-year. So I'm looking for public 4-year institutions that have policies with the word, no, I switched to grades. Sorry. Let me back up one. So these are policies related to guns. And so you can see that there's not a lot out there, at least not yet. And this is, again, coming from the sample of about 1,000 catalogs we have. So there'll be more as we get more catalogs. If I search for something that's maybe a little more common, grades, if I put the word grades in here, I'm going to get a lot of results, right? So we got 3 pages of results here, which is, roughly 300 results among the public 4-year institutions, titles only, out of the 1,000 catalogs we have in. And one of the interesting things that, like in a grade policy, is a good example of how data is sometimes structured. So a lot of policy is just a blob of text, but some policies are expressed in table format. And that was one of the hurdles we ran into fairly quickly early on, is to how to convert that into text, or whether to convert that into text. And so I said, let's collect both. We'll do like a screenshot. to show it in its kind of graphical format. And then we'll also collect it as text because it needs to be searchable behind the scenes. And this data doesn't look like it needs to be all that searchable, but there are some things that even though it's presented in a table, still needs to be text searchable. So if you look in the top right here, we've got a little picture icon, and that's a toggle. So you click on that and it'll take you to like the text version. So you can see what lies behind that, and then you can flip back to the graphical version. If we scroll down here, you can see that this record is a combination actually of a little bit of a graphic and then some text. So that's an example of how we're handling policies that are a little more visually structured. We want to maintain, we've always had this stance, even with courses, we want to maintain as much as possible the presentation that you're putting forward to students. Having said that, this is a database for you all, not for students. So, we want students, we would never try to direct students to this database. For one thing, it's for AACRAO members. So this is for your research more than it is, like absolutely the policy that's in the catalog, as of 10 minutes ago. Okay. So if I go to a really generic one like repeat and don't put any filters on there, you can see I'm getting almost every catalog we have. Out of the 902, we had 739 that had a policy with repeat in the title. If I narrow that down and just say, show me only private nonprofit, now it's 256, which also gives you an idea, by the way, how that we did, when I say we chose for diversity, we did. So here's like, we had at least 256 private nonprofit catalogs in the mix. And then if I switch to only 2 years, I get 16 that had repeat course policies. Okay. So, I mean, this is fairly obvious usage, but you can see what kind of things will be available to you. We are really concentrating. We know there's a lot that can be done with this tool, but we're concentrating first and foremost on the 20% of functionality that's going to serve 80% of the use cases, right? And we want to get that right. And then once we get a stable base of getting that right, then we'll race, on to doing some other cool things with it. Doesn't mean we don't want to hear your ideas. We will want to hear your ideas, but we want to make sure that we don't get ahead of ourselves and design something where all the bells and whistles work and none of the core function is all that great. So it's it's kind of a design principle here at CollegeSource that we work that way. And I feel good about it. That's kind of the integrity that I try to instill in the products, I guess. If I'm looking ahead, first of all, I mentioned that we had a goal for November. We hit that goal. This show and tell is kind of the culmination of that goal. We are currently in a testing, design work, and editing phase. That'll happen through February. So we're doing the last refinements on our data collection processes to make sure that we're getting everything correctly. We're testing the UI to make sure the navigation is correct. We're thinking about the look and feel, the exports, those kind of things. Come March, we'll be implementing the access control tools to make sure that once you log into AACRAO, you can get into the database, those kinds of things. And then spring, sometime in the spring, I think it'll be relatively early spring. I think you can look around the AACRAO conference, right? Always happens around Easter. I think you could look for it to be available around that time. But gotchas, you never know. As my developer always talks about, the cosmic factor. So he tells me how long something's going to take, and then he multiplies it by 3 before he puts his signature on the page telling me when it's going to be done because of the cosmic factor. So you never know what could come up between now and then. I know that when we make this live, it won't have every catalog in the United States in it. That's not our goal. It is going to take time to collect all the catalogs and to get into a routine of collecting the catalogs. But we feel like the use case is good enough that even some is better than nothing, especially if you're a policy writer. Okay. Just some ideas for the future. We're heading into the final stretch here. So I want to leave plenty of time for discussion and question and answer, because I think there might be a lot. But some ideas for the futures. One of the things that we can do is to use tags and labels. Now, when we started this project, Melanie and we were talking about what kinds of policies we collect. And we were thinking about buckets like residency policies, like grade policies. And we were coming up with these labels that we put on things. And then we realized that we were sort of making those decisions for campuses, right? Which we don't like to get into that spot as archivers of data. We want campuses and users to make those decisions. And they're not always so cut and dry, right? Like things get into that kind of gray zone. So I think one of our next things will be to think about user-driven tags and labels where we have the ability for you to kind of like mark things, and we could start building more data around and quicker searches around looking for specific types of policies. And we'll do some of that ourselves, where I mentioned that if I add a word like residency, almost every catalog in there had a policy with the word residency in its title. That's a label we could apply, for instance. So we'll work both with user labels and with our labels to kind of make the database more useful. I would like to see something like circles, where you could earmark or bookmark the institutions, like maybe a dozen institutions that are your comparables, so that you could just work within that circle most of the time, unless you wanted to take that off. But it'd be nice to have that. We are thinking about pre-2020 historic data. So once we get into a routine of collecting, we might add some resources and start going back, and finding pulling in older catalogs, so that we have some an arc. Cross-referencing policies, things like that. And I put the insert your idea here because, like I said, if you've got an idea that you'd like to see us address or a thought, feel free to float it, and it'll definitely go into our hopper of things that we're considering for the future of the product. But to reiterate, like the first iteration of this product is going to be the 20% that serves 80% of the use cases. We're kind of laser focused on that first to make sure you get something usable. I have a phrase that I sometimes say: perfection is the enemy of done. If we wait until we have all the bells and whistles, then there'll be that many years that you don't have access. And we feel like there's enough of a use case right now for the data that's in there that we might as well get it out and let you start enjoying it. And that'll help us build a better tool anyway. So with that, let me kind of transition back to Melanie here, and we'll address any questions that have come up or just have a discussion about the database itself.
There we go. Okay. Yeah, great. Thanks, Troy. This is so exciting, and honestly, really does encapsulate well the discussions that we've had up to this point, and actually has much more data available than I had hoped that we would have in a first sweep, and really does drive home the idea that AACRAO, trying to collect all of these policies from institutions, from a use of resources, I don't know how we could possibly have enough of a useful sample, and CollegeSource already having catalog data and then cleaning it up and rethinking how to package it, really is able to deliver something much better than we would have been able to do. So it's really exciting to see. It's
literally a big effort that you probably just don't have the resources for. I mean, we've had to dedicate a couple people essentially full time to it, right? It's a big job. Even if you had put out, like you said, questionnaires where people had reported policies in there, the time it takes to clean it up and to tag it for like when it, is that a live policy in your catalog today, or is that one that you're writing, or, vetting all that stuff can take a lot of time. So.
Absolutely. And so this is really exciting. Lots of comments and lots of excitement here. So I'm going to try to pick through some of these questions you have been able to answer already, but some of them kind of run along themes. So first question I'd like to just throw out there is that from an institutional perspective, we have a question about can institutions update or correct policies in the database that they see aren't correct? How would you approach that, Troy?
Right, that's a good question. One of the things that we get, even with our courses, is that institutions would like to have more control. Sometimes they'll say things like, well, we have all our courses on our website. Can you just link to those? And there's a couple reasons why not. The first one is you have to have all the data in one place if you're going to be able to search it, right? So I can't search a bunch of links. I can search data. So we have to at least capture the data in some form or another. Also, institutions are, I've got one of these days, we're going to do a webinar about how the catalog's transformed in the web era. Like, because, those of us who bridge the gap and sort of remember the print deadlines and all that, fundamentally, the way we produce catalogs has changed, and they've become more evergreen and dispersed across websites. And so when we snapshot something, it's kind of an archival record of what was actually said at the time. And so allowing institutions to sort of change those would mean which we are thinking about. We are thinking about having an editing thing there, but we'd have to, first of all, vet that the person at the institution has the right to change that policy, like update that policy. So that gets tricky. And then we have to make sure that if they change the policy, that it's a correction to the way it really was on the website at the time or in the catalog at the time, or whether they're telling us what the new policy is, right? Or how it should have been said versus how it was said. Those kinds of things really matter a lot. And that's the only way you can see growth. So we've all written bad policy at some point. Let's just face it, right? It's nothing to be embarrassed about. When it's your first time out, sometimes you forget something, sometimes you word it poorly. And as you change it over time, that change is helpful to see, right? So what we don't want is kind of a revisionist world where people are going back and changing policies. What we want is an archival world where we can see like, oh, this policy has been updated and now it says this. Okay. So yes, step one for us, we are considering that, but step one for us would be, probably step one for us is going to be to have you to have some submission form where you contact us and say, hey, there's a newer version of this policy available. Can you update it? And we'll take care of it. And then next version might entail like authorized users and such, but that's probably a little far out there.
Excellent. Here's a technical question around how you use it. If our institution currently submits a copy of our catalog annually to CollegeSource to provide course data for tests, will that also cover our submission of our catalog for this database?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, it's simple, but like this is one of those things that like sounds simple, and sometimes people often undervalue the database that we put together. And I don't mean to like, I'm not trying to get on a pedestal and crow about what we do. It is not easy. We get catalogs in hundreds of different formats, and but a lot of times they're on the web. But yes, if we have a routine with you now where we're getting your catalog, you won't have to do anything else. Yeah.
Excellent. And just as to reiterate that sort of process, in earlier meetings that I have sat in with you and your data team talking through kind of how you're sifting through the data, it's an enormous job to identify and clean up and put it in a format. And so I'm very aware and I'm very appreciative. Lots of comments around features. And so I'm going to just read out some of those, Troy, and,
okay. Yeah.
a couple at a time, and you can kind of react to them. So
I'll get my opening presents face ready.
That's right. Exactly. So questions about filtering. So thinking about adding filters for graduate instead of just 2-year and 4-year graduate catalogs, filters around.
Yeah, let me address that. That actually is probably a really early one or an easy one to do, because those are typically in the title of the catalog, right? So graduate, undergraduate, continuing ed, those kinds of things. So some of those could be probably handled either through labels or through filters. Yeah.
So there is a comment about also about that labeling and filtering. So even before you started talking about labeling, we had a user ask about how are you going to establish a consistent system of labeling on types of policies, or are you only going to rely on each institution's categorization? And then there were comments in chat that I'm going to tie to that. Okay. And there were some suggestions in chat that perhaps as you start to solidify that labeling, maybe we think about convening a beta test kind of user group to think about how we do that. That was
sure.
Possible.
Okay, cool idea. Let me I'm going to try to say this in a gentle way so that I don't offend anyone. There's times when I think that CollegeSource has a strong product set and a strong business concept, somewhat based on the idea that institutions aren't very good at sharing data or sharing data consistently. It takes, and the reason I say that is because like you would think something simple like a catalog, or in the case of AACRAO, a transcript, right? You'd think like there's kind of some common elements. And so we should be able to get together and come up with a common rubric or data set. And it's part of what PESC has worked on and some other groups, And it seems like an easy task, but then the more voices you get in the room, the more differences you have, the more people that want to drag it in different directions or add things to the structure because it makes shades of difference. I'll give you an example that's not related to this, but like common course numbering. When common course numbering was introduced in Florida, it can be a really strong idea, and it works, I think, fairly well in Florida. So I'm not going to pick on it, but if you take something like Accounting 101, you'll quickly find out that there are about 12 shades of Accounting 101. It's not just Accounting 101, right? So maintaining consistency means that you have to have a strong, consistent presence at the top doing that. So first of all, I think the first question was excellent, and both questions are excellent, but I want to address the first one first, which is this idea of like vetted labels versus like personal labels, right? And I think that, yes, we're going to have to make some distinction there, that like there may be labels that we agree to kind of like stamp as an official label and then apply that versus ones where that are just more of like tags that people have applied, word cloud kind of things that people have applied to it. So this is all a little bit, I'm talking a little bit ahead of where we're at in the design process. So these aren't firm answers, but it's a definite, whoever asked that question is really onto the kind of problem, which is, yeah, consistency is tricky. Now, to the second one, I think we'd welcome a user group on that. Having said that, I don't know, sometimes that adds more complexity than is helpful. And if you don't have continuity and things like that, so we'd have to be very careful how that's structured. But I think I think we could definitely make use of that, right? Or give an entity like that some access to kind of do some things, even outside of CollegeSource, to kind of work those labels and such. So it's a good idea. It's a good idea.
Another sort of theme around some of these questions are around where you might find other policies. So we're collecting catalogs. And so there are policies in catalogs, but there's some questions about, some folks are unfamiliar about what kinds of policies would be in a catalog and what might be found elsewhere. Some institutions have decided to put together things like student handbooks, where some of those policies exist that maybe traditionally were in a catalog or not. And so how are you handling that? What are your thoughts on that?
It's risky to get me started on this because I feel like this is the webinar I'm talking about. Like, this is kind of an unspoken existential crisis for campuses. What is a catalog, right? What is the catalog now? Especially if you don't print a catalog. Do you still collect something that looks like a physical catalog that's all connected, right? That's indexed in one place or not? Some schools don't. They're all over the place. So policies might be hidden within a department website. They might be hidden like within a student handbook. It is tricky for us to like determine where to look and where not to look. We try to be comprehensive from the viewpoint of like finding our way into it. If an institution doesn't supply us with a catalog, if they supply us, we sort of expect that they're handing us the catalog, right? So if they have policies outside of that, I would question whether students know where to find those policies. But if they do, then maybe we'll have to start collecting like student handbooks and stuff. The second thing is if we have to go to a website to collect, or they point us to a website to collect, we sort of branch out from that top level, look everywhere that we think is, we can find something, and we find it and put it in. We try to err on the side of inclusivity, of trying to grab everything. But yeah, we can easily miss some stuff. That's why I'm saying, like, again, let's not confuse this policy database as where your students are going to look for policies. This is where researchers and you all as policy writers are going to look to find. So it's not as dramatic if something's missing or slightly out of date than it would be if it was like somebody affected by the policy, right? Yeah, but yeah, good question.
Exactly. Yeah, it almost, I hesitate to say this, but as we're talking about this and as questions are coming up, it's almost making me think about, do we need a catalog standard? And who would do that? Would that
Good
be,
luck.
Right, exactly. Would that,
yeah.
Thinking about categories of accreditation and what's required there and state requirements and how do you, what's the convergence there?
Well, and all the vendors that are in the scene, right? So you've got different vendors that put together catalogs, so they would all have to kind of buy in. It's the same problem with student information systems. It's the same problem with transcripts. It's the same problem with sort of any official record keeping or, yeah, I mean, would it be nice to have consistency? Yeah. Would it be nice to have standards? Yes, it would. Are we any closer today to those than we were 15 years ago? I think we are a little closer, but this is an old idea that it's an ever-changing target. Let me put it that way. So I'm not trying to say that we're doing something wrong as a higher ed community. It is a moving target, and therefore it requires a huge effort and a comprehensive effort, and then some authority, right? So you not only have to have the right people working on it, they have to have the authority to kind of make those recommendations for people and have people look to them and follow it. There's a lot to that, but sure. In the end, we're as a company, we kind of take the practical side of it, which is great. Hope institutions get there. If they don't, what can we do to make stuff usable as it is, right? So we just sort of deal with the reality. The ideal is a different story, and I would love to see some of that stuff come to being as well. But it would honestly, and you'd think we might lose business over that, but we won't, because it would make our job a lot easier. So all of a sudden our collection practices get cheaper and such. So yeah, but until then, we'll do it this way.
Yeah. Some other sort of future questions. How about reporting? Reports around tags, is that something that future development you could foresee?
Right. So there's always two steps to, and first of all, let's recognize that the word reporting is funny these days, because it really just means what you can pull up onto the screen, because you can always just print the screen or cut and paste or whatever. We are providing Excel exports, probably PDF exports on top of that. So yeah, we'll have different forms of exports, but what the question really is how well can I filter what's coming up on the screen, right? So obviously right now you can kind of see what some of the filters are today, what you could include in an export, but it'll get better with things like labels. So if we had a label, let's pick a really basic label like repeat policies, okay? If we went through and automatically applied the repeat policy label, that could be a filter, and you click that, and that means that's what's filtered onto the screen. That is then what gets into your report, right? There are other kinds of reports, but as far as those, that's, yeah. I mean, there's reports about usage, and there's reports about maybe percentages, like more aggregated data, like percentages of colleges with a certain type of policy, those kinds of reports. That's really something that's a bell and whistle that we're thinking about later on. But yeah.
Another question we have asks about, will there be any non-US institutions included? I know that TESS includes some non-US institutions. What are your thoughts there?
It's a good question. Right now it's domestic, including territories and such, right? So English speaking, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that yet. It's something we're mulling over, right? Whether we would include international catalogs, especially international catalogs not in English, becomes a whole, might just be scope creep for us. And I hate to say that, but it just might be beyond what we're capable of doing.
Yeah, it might make sense, US branch campuses overseas, perhaps, if it's not in the, but
those kind of things for sure. Right. But I think like, as far as like, let's just take Europe. Okay. I kind of feel like that's, while it would be good for CollegeSource to do that, maybe that's Europe's task to do, but we might, we're not opposed to that. We don't have the resources today to kind of get into that level of collection, but it's a possibility.
Another question has to do, there are a couple of suggestions that talk about the connection to other vendors. So catalog vendors, and do you have connections? Are you pulling any catalog data from catalog vendors? Is that part of your process already?
Yes. Yeah. Some vendors make it easier than others to kind of for schools, but having said that, we have discussions with the other vendors. We're very friendly with catalog vendors. We try not to take their place or like get in their way, because we want to be more agnostic in terms of collecting, right? But we always deal with the institution. So we would never, if you're an institution, I would never go and let's say you use AACRAO. I would never go straight to DigArc and say, hey, can I have that institution's catalog? I'm coming to you first, right? So however you want to give it to me, you might actually not want to use the export from your catalog management system. You might want to use something else. So this brings up another complexity that people don't think about a lot. We see this a lot in course descriptions where people think that course descriptions are in the student information system. And most of the time they are. There was a day, however, when those fields had more limitations, and some of the SISs still have limitations, like character limitations. And so course titles and course descriptions get truncated, and we try to collect the full like, because we're dealing with people trying to make decisions, right? And so we want them to see the full information. And so sometimes that means, like, while we could get an export from a database, it's actually not the best place to get the data, which sounds weird, but that's the case. And one of the complexities we deal with is the title of the course versus what you print on your transcript, or even the title of the department. You know, some departments are literally in the catalog English composition, right? But on the transcript they're ENG. So, you know, we deal with those complexities all the time. Something we're used to. Just kind of remind people. So that's why we try to collect always by permission, right? So we don't just take. We go to our users, we go to people even who aren't our users, we collect from everybody. We try to get a relationship built where they tell us where they want us to look for the catalog or send us the catalog.
Great. In terms of historic, there's a question here. Do you reference where the policy came from? Catalog year, handbook, if expanding the database?
Yeah. So CollegeSource data is institution, right? Like, this isn't the whole database structure, but institution, title. For us, title means like undergraduate versus graduate or continuing ed, right? Edition, which is the year it's from, and then things like department, course, whatever, falling on down. So yes, you will see the institution, the title, and the edition that each policy is from. So you'll know whether it's from a graduate, undergraduate. You'll know whether it's from 2012 or 2020. You'll know whether it's from Iowa State or Indiana University. Yeah.
Great. Some suggestions on additional filters, something like institution size or FTE. That's something that is an interesting piece. And then
my guess is that some of that stuff that's in the profile data that we already have, we could add pretty quickly as filters. Kind of one of the trade-offs is screen real estate and like complexity. So there was a product, I won't name it, but at one point when I took over at CollegeSource as president, we had an older product, and the front page of that product had 60 some clickable links on it. And I was like, how do people choose, right? This is insane. If you look at well-used websites for commercial reasons or whatever, a dozen or less clickable items is typical. So filter sets are something that, like, I'm interested in adding a lot more filters. At the same time, we may have to like do like hide and show kind of things to make it, because I want the tool first and foremost to feel simple and usable and practical. And then to kind of get, and I know that some of what makes it practical is actually having more of those filters. So we'll have to strike a balance there. But yeah, I think that's next steps for us, is to really add more of that filtering. It actually helps the product perform better anyway, because the more filters you apply, the smaller the data set you're searching, the quicker it's going to search, the less CPU cycles it goes through. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are near the end. I think we have one other question that we have time for, and I'll comment. There are a couple of comments around accreditors, and that we might want to share this database or demo this database for accreditors for suggestions, questions that it might help with standardization.
Sure.
To think about. There's a question,
especially if they're willing to put skin in the game. Right now, we're
exactly.
Right now, keep in mind. So maybe it's worth saying, AACRAO isn't paying us for this. We're doing this on our own dime because, like I said, we believe in a stronger AACRAO. It is expensive. It's time intensive. So I would be a little reluctant to have too many people driving things when we're footing the bill. That sounds very negative. I don't mean to sound that way, but I actually would really welcome input from accreditors. And then we probably get into a fight about which accreditors and things like that. But
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not opposed to feedback from other organizations or like a council or whatever. I think that'd be great, but we also have to keep it doable for us. Yeah.
Absolutely. And that leads to the, I would say, the closing question, which is around the cost to institutions or users to have access. And so it's a significant investment by CollegeSource to do this work. And we are planning to give access to our members. So there's not, we have no plans right now to do any kind of additional fee. It is a member access tool. So it would be behind the member firewall. Absolutely. It's not going to be just open, but the plan is that this will be a resource for members. As we think about product development, as things might shift and change, as we might add additional features, there might be other things, but right now the vision is to provide a useful tool for AACRAO members, and CollegeSource has invested a significant amount of time and resources to make that happen, and we are incredibly grateful. And we want to pass that on to our members. So thank you to CollegeSource, and thank you to Troy for all of that work.
Thank you.
As Troy said, we're shooting for spring, so you never know. I'm certain that regardless of whether the product is ready to launch or not, you're going to hear more about it at the AACRAO annual meeting. You may have noticed that we have moved that annual meeting to a virtual meeting this year. The dates are the same, March 28th to 31st. And we hope that we will be able to welcome lots of you at our annual meeting. We missed you last year, and we hope to see you all virtually this year. I want to thank again Troy for being with us this afternoon, and I want to thank all of you for giving you our time. And we look forward to seeing you at some of our other virtual events this month and into the spring. Thanks so much.
Thank you.